So this time we're going to look at interactions. So there's like two types of interactions that we are concerned with here. So there's micro interactions, which are elements of your user interface. And then there might be other interactions that your system has with a backend or other parts of the world that it interacts with. So for the micro interactions, they are described in this book by Dan Saffer. And one of the sort of important principles that are highlighted in the book here is that the design the design of your product is only as good as its smallest part. Now, we're not going to focus so much on the actual graphical design, but more on how you navigate your system and how the different parts sort of interact with one another. And the way that it's suggested that we look at interactions, micro interactions, is in terms of triggers and rules, feedback, and loops and modes. Now, triggers is what initiate a micro interaction. And a rule is what determines how that micro interaction works. A feedback is what visualizes or illuminates the rules, so basically what happens inside the system. And loops and modes can be considered sort of as meta rules that affect or maybe modulate the micro interaction and how your system works. So here's an example of a password selection form, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So the trigger here is that you can hit a key, and when you hit a key on your keyboard, there will be a immediate feedback shown, which is just that there's a star, or in this case, I think a dot shown on the screen. There's also a rule that runs in the background and checks the validity of the password, and at any given time tries to give you some kind of hints. Those hints are an additional feedback that's also given, but the rule might even say that, well, if you try to if you press the enter key here, it's not going to accept the password. It has to be at least a good password before it's accepted. So here's an example where it's quite visible to see what are the triggers. Triggers are like you pressing keys. The feedback can be either the stars or the text next to the entry box. And the rule is what determines what happens behind the scenes. So that's what the system is actually doing while you're looking at the screen. Another example is here from, I think, a pretty old version of Microsoft Office. So you can see different buttons here, and when you press a button, you trigger it, and you typically get immediate feedback because the button changes from blue to yellow in this case, so you can see it becomes active. The rule is that whatever is selected maybe changes color or changes the alignment the moment you click the button. And it might also be possible that if you haven't selected any text and then click another of these alignment buttons, then the mode changes so that any text you enter hereafter is now maybe right aligned instead of being center aligned or something. Another example, final example here is a sort of a lock button. You have two triggers here. So there's a slider you can use to unlock the phone. And the feedback is that the slider actually moves as you move your finger. And the rule is, of course, that if you slide it, then the phone unlocks, and then it changes mode. Then you can type in different things. You can interact with the phone in a different way hereafter. The other trigger here, the potential trigger, is the camera icon. So if you click that, you can take an image, and you can maybe, in some cases on some phones, do that as here, without unlocking the phone. So when you design things, it's good to think about trigger areas and make sure that they are familiar to people, so you can see that you can trigger them, that they are sometimes what we call an affordance, is that it gives the user the possibility of performing an action, or you sort of understand that here's a possible action. They should be accessible, meaning that you can execute the trigger, you can click on it, it should be visible and so on. And it's also often a good design principle that triggers are persistent, so they don't sort of move around or jump away from your screen, but they are there and you can trigger them. If you cannot trigger them, they might be sort of disabled, shown gray, but it's a good principle that they are on the screen in the same place anytime you need them. And it's also good that you're consistent. So coming back to this issue of familiarity, that you can recognize that this is a button, you can trigger it by clicking it, or if it's a slider thing, that you immediately recognize that, okay, what I should do to interact with this part here in a micro interaction is simply to slide my finger. Triggers are, when we talk about micro interactions, they are often based on user needs, but they can also in some cases be system initiated. So pressing a button is something that the user is doing, but reaching an intersection on your road, or you're getting back into your home and open the door and you're connected now to your Wi-Fi, could be other triggers that initiate some other kind of interactions that you might be interested in, such as like switching on the light or changing your phone from playing your Spotify in your headphones to suddenly start playing them on your speakers at home. Rules are what determine the response, and they can be simple, which they are in many cases, but they can also be quite complex. I would encourage you to, when you design systems, to try to not make them too complex. Often you can describe maybe a few additional steps and then have less complex rules than trying to make a very complex rule. So one example of a rule here is that if you're playing Spotify, you can actually make Spotify play somewhere else. So if I have my device like it's shown here on the left, and I click on it, I can start and stop and interact with it. But if I'm now switching, so I'm listening on another device, then the first time I sort of interact with it hereafter, it will actually tell me that, well, you're listening on somewhere else. So if you want to continue your listening experience on this phone, then I need to do something else before I interact with the system. Rules can be described, of course, as sort of logic diagrams like here. So this is an example of placing elements in a sort of shopping system. And one of the rules here is that there's a UI change. So if you already have placed something in your shopping cart, maybe it's not just buy this, but then it's add another one to your cart. And it's sometimes also something that sort of leads to a state change. So you basically save something when you are clicking the final button to say, yeah, I want to do this. Then it's added somewhere to your behind the scenes to your cart. And of course, that should be made visible also somewhere to the user, so you know that there's now one element more. Feedback shows the users what's happening. It's something that should match the action, and it can be, of course, instantaneous, or it can be something that takes time. It can be visual, it can be oral, it can be haptic. I mean, most of us are familiar with the sounds that happens when you receive an email, or maybe when you send a message to somebody, or if you get a message in some one of your other social interaction apps. A simple example is here of one that takes time. So if you do something that is not immediate, it's often a very good idea to give the user an idea that this is something that is in progress. So you press the button, you know immediately you pressed it, the system accepted that you pressed it. It'll just take some time until it's completed, and then you can see here when it's done. Loops and modes are what can modulate or change the rules. So one really simple and maybe trivial example is that if you use the on-off button to switch off your phone, then of course the home key on your phone doesn't work any longer like it normally does to just wake your phone up when you put your finger there. So the phone is off. That's another mode than when it's on. But it can be also much more complex than that. One of the examples from the book here is a loop where if you have bought an item previously, then instead of having buy it now, then it maybe says buy another, because you already have performed this once. So you can just add one more, and you can keep clicking until you have filled up your cart or there are no more available. Another example of a mode, which is actually sort of quite complex, is what happens when you put your phone to priority mode, or if you put it into don't disturb. This is something that has changed over time. On my current phone, I actually have a slider that I can use, but you might think about how it works on your phone. So if you silence your phone, is it actually silencing everything, or will the alarm work, or will the media output continue? What happens if you're in Spotify and you remove the headset? Does it change to a different mode, or is it just a trigger that causes Spotify to stop at this point? So it's not uncommon to see people quite confused about their phone making noises even though they thought it shouldn't, because the alarm went off. And there are some horror examples of this happening to people sitting maybe at a theater, thinking they had switched their phone to silent mode, but they forgot that their alarm was maybe still on. One way of sort of describing all of this is to use arrows and annotations on your wireframes. And I'll give a few examples here. So here's a little part of a system, and if we kind of zoom in on it here, you can see that there's a trigger described. So you can click on Austin Martin here, which is in this case a patient that's in a list. So the trigger is that the user clicks on that. And the feedback in this case is that the screen changes immediately. You see a different view. And then there are some rules connected with this also. If the weight has increased for the last couple of days more than 1.7 kilo or whatever, then it might be yellow. And if it's critical, if the patient here has gained a lot in weight for the last 2 days, then it might become red instead. Another example is here. So you can see there's a button you can click on, and it's shown by an arrow that clicking that sort of jumps to another screen. So the trigger is that the user clicks the start new conversation here. The rule is then that the system starts the GPS up, tries to find out any users nearby, and the feedback is then initially that you're shown a waiting screen, and at some point maybe the system will find some additional users and will populate the waiting screen, and then you can start and continue the interaction again. So again, this is an example of using arrows with some annotations describing what your system is doing. But arrows and annotations on your storyboard can also show interaction with other systems. So that might be that your system is sending data, or it's requesting data, or it's even accepting events that are happening elsewhere. So these are not micro-interactions, but it's a different way of using the interaction sort of concept to describe how your system works. So the whole purpose of doing a big wireframe where every screen is shown and connected is that you can sort of show to others and discuss with others what should happen and what your system is doing. And I've made one final example here of an app. This is an app that is used to register birds that you might see in some specific areas. And on the screen on the left, you can click on one of your previous trips. And the trigger here is then that you press that entry in the list. The rule here is a little bit more complex, because now you request observations that are stored somewhere in a big database. And then you prepare the next screen and you change to edit observation mode, and the feedback then is that the next screen will be shown here. But the next screen is initially empty, maybe, and at some point there's another trigger, which is kind of a system-initiated trigger here, that you now receive some of the observations back, and then you populate the list, and the feedback that the user sees is that, okay, now everything is on the screen, and you can see what your previous observations were. And on that screen, then you might click like the +1 here next to the Dunlins. And instead of 750, you found another one, so there's now 751. So you press the +1 button, that's the trigger. The rule here is that the count is incremented, so it becomes 751 at some point, and that's also the feedback you see. But at the same time, the back end is also updated, so you send information away. So that's the final example for today. So interactions can either be micro-interactions, so that's how the users interact with different design elements, or you can also use the interaction concept to describe how your system interacts with other parts of the bigger system or maybe something else. And the way to describe that can be in your wireframes, listing arrows and annotating the arrows.